sur la recherche. Mais c'est un sujet intéressant parce que là, elle va, or she's going to, introduce us in a period of Senegal's life which is very significant, and maybe which Senegalese should not forget. Every time I drive by here to come to my office, and there is this place which is called Place du Souvenir. And I'm going to fight this with the Ministry of Culture. They put all manners of faces and says, these are the faces representing la Place du Souvenir africain. You put Nelson Mandela, you put Martin Luther King, you put Thomas Sankara, you put Malcolm X, you put, what's his name, Patrice Lumumba. All of them are there representing Souvenir Africain. Where is Léopold Sédar Senghor? From the same Senegalese people, without whom the dimension of culture in this country would not be the same. Who created Théâtre Daniel Sorano? Senghor. Who planted the seed for the Grand Théâtre? Léopold Sédar Senghor. Who planted the seeds for the Museum of Black Civilization? Léopold Sédar Senghor. Who created the company in chess, which is la manufacture des tapisseries du Senegal? Léopold Sédar Senghor. Who flew all over the world. Maybe the exception would be countries like Mongolia, but almost everywhere, bringing, Senegalese traditional musicians, making them plays and discussing poetry, African poetry with them, Léopold Sédar Senghor. And our leaders decided on this place to completely forget, the face of Senghor and put, figures which, although they are black figures, could be considered to be foreign. Go in the villages and ask them who Martin Luther King is. What are they going to tell you? This is a fight I'm going to personally take. Now, to come back to your subject, trying to see how, African cultural background could be introduced in the curing process in some of our hospitals. And I remember what I saw there when I visited. It was, Centre Hospitalier de Femmes, but also it is the center located in Kilroy. How they use Senegalese traditional curing therapeutic, procedures, but to integrate them to more modern way of, trying to help people get back to their senses or to themselves. And that was a great initiative. And maybe the conclusion you have that unfortunately it could not be continued is to our own loss. Well, I'm not specialist. So without further ado, I would like again thank you for attending, and I will give her the floor so that you may enter this conversation together. Thank you for selecting us to make this presentation.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I will be sitting somewhere.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you to everybody at WARC and WARC for making it possible for me to be here today. Yeah, there's a lot in that for getting Senghor. Well, first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Kilroy Marac, and I am an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto, where I've been since 2013. Before that, I was teaching as a visiting assistant professor at Sarah Lawrence College. I did my undergraduate work at the University of Wisconsin in French and African Studies and anthropology, and then I did my master's degree and my PhD at Columbia University. So what do I want to do today? Okay, so I'm going to be presenting work from one of the chapters of my book that was recently published called An Impossible Inheritance, Post-Colonial Psychiatry and the Work of Memory in a West African Clinic. And if there's time, I'd also love to say a few words about the new project that I'm working on. It's a project that has me mostly in the archives right now, working on a moment in colonial psychiatry between the 1890s and World War I, when the French colonial regime transported West African psychiatric patients to Marseille to be institutionalized in an asylum in Marseille.
Okay.
Ça va mieux?
I want to.
It's better. Okay, yes, thanks. So the book that I've just written has grown out of something like 20 years. I mean, ridiculous, it took me such a long time to write it. Something like 20 years of ethnographic and archival research. The ethnographic component took place in the Service de Psychiatrie Clinique Moussa Diop, which is one of many specialized medical facilities that make up the Fan Hospital right down the street from here. You all probably know what it's all about. So this is a really extraordinary place with a rich history, and it's also a kind of contested history. It was established 4 years before Senegal's independence, and after an interim director was ahead of the hospital, a French military psychiatrist by the name of Henri Collomb took over as the director of the clinic in 1959. So I'm not following with the slides here. So I have just some information about myself here, and this is the cover of my book, and then this is the Fan Psychiatric Clinic. Bonjour, hello. So when he took over in 1959, he had intended to stay for not such a long time. He ended up staying at Fan for 20 years, until 1979. And over the 2 decades that he was the director of the Fan Psychiatric Clinic, he and, along with his colleagues, most of whom were also European, channeled much of their energy, their resources into sociological and anthropological research, innovative clinical practice, and also pretty innovative theoretical inquiry. So Collomb's project is a project from 1959 to 1971 that spans, and in some ways, I argue, joins together or bridges the colonial and the post-colonial, as Senghor himself did, and this may be one of the reasons why in this particular political moment, Senghor is a figure who gets forgotten very often, right? Because it's very, in a kind of a moment of identity politics, Senghor was a complicated figure as a Francophile, as somebody who kept a very close relationship with France throughout his career as a writer and as a politician. He maybe doesn't sit as a kind of freedom-fighting revolutionary the way Patrice Lumumba does, right? So he's a little bit, it's a little bit more difficult to kind of write a hagiography of Senghor at this particular moment, I think. So I should say, in my book, as I'm talking about the Fan Psychiatric Clinic, its past and its present and possibly its future, I am very complimentary of the work that's been done there, and I'm also very critical of the projects as they existed and as they existed in the past and as they exist in the present. And hopefully that'll come out a little bit in what I'm going to say now. So Collomb and his mostly European colleagues, they came to be known as what was called L'École de Fan, or the Fan School of Psychiatry. And this group became world-renowned in the field of transcultural psychiatry. They also trained the first generation of Senegalese psychiatrists. There had been 4 psychiatrists from Senegal who were being educated and formed in France, who ended up being called back to Senegal in the 1960s. So there were some who had been trained abroad and coming back, but he really put into place kind of the training necessary for this first generation of Senegalese psychiatrists. So the group not only positioned itself as a radical departure from the kind of carceral models of colonial psychiatric care that had come before Fan, but it also challenged conventional Western psychiatric models by attempting to establish a truly transcultural psychiatry that, amongst other things, would bring local ideas about madness and therapy into conversation with Western, more conventional psychiatric approaches at that time. One of the things that Collomb and his colleagues did was take this concept of culture as a point of departure for thinking about psychiatry. And Collomb and the Fan School worked with local healers. They studied local culture, mostly Wolof and Lebu, but also Serer. They studied healing customs as well as daily life in Senegal, with the goal of creating a more effective psychiatric practice at Fan. So the group's ethnographic and ethnological research really does still stand as a significant contribution to the fields of anthropology and transcultural psychiatry. And this work that they did really inspired Collomb and his colleagues to reassess both the physical space of the FAN clinic and the model of patient care that would be offered at FAN during the years that he was there. For all of this, FAN even came to be celebrated as a kind of exemplary institution of the new Senegalese state during the 1960s and 1970s. And this is the piece of the story that I'm going to be focusing on. It's going to be kind of at the center of my talk today. Very interestingly, though, I mean, I find the story interesting, but of course, I've kind of been, working on it for a long time. By the mid-1970s, things really began to change at FAN, and there are several different reasons for this. First off, the first generation of Senegalese psychiatrists began to replace Collomb and his European colleagues. Some of them, although very grateful to Collomb and his colleagues, thought that a time for change had come. A couple who I interviewed, who I spoke with, Collomb said, Collomb stayed as a kind of colonial father in the clinic until 1979, which was very long after independence. So the new generation of Senegalese psychiatrists, they were very eager to kind of Senegalize the clinic. And they thought that Collomb's extended presence there was maybe a little bit too much, a little overbearing. They weren't allowed to do the kind of work that they wanted to do. So as this first generation of Senegalese psychiatrists began to take over from Collomb and his mostly European colleagues, this generation began to distance itself a little bit from the brand of transcultural psychiatry that had been really kind of established as FAN's trademark during the 1960s and 1960s. And also, they began to distance themselves from questions of culture and questions of cultural difference more generally. Collomb's heirs were as weary of FAN's collaborative work with local healers and healing traditions as they were reluctant to engage in the kind of cross-cultural research that had been produced by this group. So what I try to do in my book is I try to kind of tell the story of Collomb's distinctive project in cross-cultural psychiatry and also its falling out of fashion in Senegal, and ask the question why, right? Why did this first generation of Senegalese psychiatrists let go of Collomb's project? And I also look specifically at how the clinic's past, especially the 1960s and 1970s, has come to be remembered and also forgotten in today's FAN psychiatric clinic. So there are really interesting traces that still exist of this time, yet many people kind of say, we're doing something different now. Our project is different. If we stay and kind of dwell on the past, what kind of good can we do in the present, right? So my book is also a kind of meditation on why history, right? Why do history? I also take the clinic as a really powerful lens through which to see the post-colonial Senegalese state and how it's been reflected and refracted over the last kind of 6 decades. So through the clinic, I see the changes that have been made in the state, the kind of neoliberal transformations to Senegal, the major structural adjustment policies that were put into place in the 1980s, especially in early 1990s, that dramatically affected the clinic. Okay, so moving on specifically to the story that I want to tell today. So shortly after the 1979 death of Collomb, Senghor penned an obituary that appeared in the journal Psychopathologie Africaine. It was titled Henri Collomb, 1913 à 1979, ou l'art de mourir aux préjugés. It was a 3-page obituary that applauded Collomb and his colleagues at FAN for creating an institution that was as uniquely Senegalese as it was distinctively modern. In his view, in Senghor's view, FAN was nothing less than an exemplary institution of the new Senegalese state. So Senghor and others, they understood FAN to be innovative in at least 2 ways. First, because FAN represented a departure from the colonial psychiatric practices that had come before, like I mentioned. And second, because FAN's distinctive approach really did challenge the more conventional Western psychiatric practices of its day. But it was not just FAN's divergence from colonial psychiatry or conventional psychiatry that made Senghor take interest in FAN during his time as president. Rather, one of the things I'm arguing in my book is that Collomb's FAN was celebrated specifically because it embodied and symbolized Senghor's new national aesthetic in the 1960s and 1970s, rooted in negritude and actualized by l'École de Dakar, the Dakar School. In Senghor's eyes, this Fan psychiatric clinic actualized, or really brought to life, this new kind of Senegalese modernity that he was envisioning. Okay, so I want to rewind just a little bit from 1979 to 1959 when Collomb shows up at Fan. So Collomb, then 45 years old, was appointed to the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Dakar. Though he had only just arrived in Senegal, he had worked in sub-Saharan Africa for years. As a member of the Free French Forces, he had begun his overseas career as a military doctor in 1939, first in Djibouti and then in Somalia. He had worked in Ethiopia, where he served as a doctor for Haile Selassie in his court, as well as for the general population from 1943 to 1948. And during the early 1950s, Collomb had been stationed in French Indochina. Upon his arriving at Fan, Collomb found a relatively conventional psychiatric clinic by Western standards, which was itself hugely innovative for the colonies. From the layout of the building to its administrative structure and the patient care it offered, Fan looked very much like a psychiatric clinic might have looked in France at the time. Elsewhere in the book, I kind of frame the building of the Fan Hospital as a product of 1950s welfare colonialism that the French colonial regime kind of put into place. So there was a kind of rush toward citizen welfare in the 1950s as kind of last act of the colonial era, and Fan was one of the buildings that was put into place during that time. So at that time at Fan, each of the clinic's 5 divisions was headed by a European doctor and closely monitored by a team of nurses. Doctors examined the patients weekly to check their progress. Patients were not permitted to move about the halls unless supervised, and the doors on the rooms were locked from the outside. The clinic was also closed to the exterior, and patients' families, and friends had to adhere to strict visiting hours. Over the next 2 decades, though, many changes would take place at Fan under Collomb. Reflecting on his first few years at the clinic, Collomb confided to a Parisian audience in 1976 that we began at Fan with Western psychiatry as it was practiced in Europe during the 1950s and 1960s. The director of the clinic and his colleagues in white examined the patient without worrying too much about the patient's own words and estimated from his symptoms the degree of his illness. So their early approach to mental illness at Fan, Collomb says, led physical symptoms to be privileged over words, as well as over the meanings that patients attributed to their distress. The patient was more or less treated as a biological organism whose social and cultural environment, interpersonal relationships, and past experiences really had little to do with the diagnosis or the treatment that he or she would receive in the clinic. For the patients during these early years, the clinical environment, though a far cry from the kind of carceral horrors that had been kept manual, that was where the patients had been kept before Fan, was sterile and alienating. Aïssatou, who began working at Fan as a nurse in 1962 at the age of 23 and retired in 1992, recalled that when she first started working at the clinic, patients were still shut up in their rooms. Quote, they only got to go outside once or twice a week, and even then it was only so the rooms could be cleaned. This, however, was all about to change. She continued, but then, one day, not long after I began working at Fan, Collomb went down to Casamance for the first time to visit a healer. This healer had many mentally ill patients in his care, and he let them move about freely. Collomb saw this and asked the healer, why do you let them roam about as they wish? The healer told Collomb, if one wants to treat a mentally ill person, one must consider him as one would consider oneself. He should not be isolated. If he is, he will withdraw, pull away. It will be impossible to help him. As soon as Collomb returned to Fan, Aïssatou told me, he changed everything. He gave the patients their freedom. All at once, he opened doors, took off the locks, and allowed the patients to move about as they pleased. They were able to go anywhere they wanted. They were able to sit outside, walk around, and talk to each other. So Aïssatou admitted that, Aïssatou admitted that at first the personnel, herself included, were apprehensive about Collomb's decision to change the clinic in this way. It was hard for us at first, she said. We were scared, and yes, there were incidents every now and then. Once a patient hit me over the head with a brick and I lost consciousness. When I opened my eyes, there was blood all over me. Despite her gruesome story, though, she insisted that it was still much better for patients to be able to move around as they pleased rather than to be locked in their cells. According to her, Collomb realized just how important their freedom was to the patients. It kept them from feeling too isolated, and in turn, they recovered faster. Notably, Collomb's early visits with healers across Senegal marked the beginning of a long-term collaboration. Collomb paid visits to these healers frequently and likewise welcomed them to visit the clinic. These became the kind of origin stories upon which the new Fan psychiatric clinic came to be built. In 1967, just a few years after Collomb began instituting all of these changes, a Fan psychiatrist named Dr. Daniel Bartoli would write that the conventional psychiatric model had not been successful because it was too different from what patients were accustomed to in their everyday lives. Quote, the individual was isolated by this structure that was foreign to him. Coming from a collective life, he entered a world of individual existence. Coming from traditional society, he was confronted with a Western way of life. As such, Bartoli explained, hospitalization may itself have been a traumatic experience for the patients, and thus completely counterproductive to the therapeutic process. He contrasted the old model with the way Fan was organized in 1968. Quote, the hospital is largely open to the exterior and also on the interior between divisions. Patients go freely throughout the hospital, they come and go as they please. They have constant access to the doctor's offices. Their families almost always have access to the hospital as well. There are no longer any visiting hours. Some patients' families spend entire days and sometimes even nights with them, end quote. So according to Bartoli, this new model allowed patients to remain connected or help them to reestablish connections to their social worlds. This, he said, was crucial for the establishment of an effective psychiatric practice in Senegal. Collomb wholeheartedly agreed, writing that psychiatric care must be inspired by the sociocultural conditions of each country, and therefore psychiatry in Africa should be adapted to the realities of African societies. So this trope of African collective life, which was depicted in sharp contrast to the individualization and atomization of life in the West, became central to Collomb's project at Fan. Views of a kind of essentialized and often idealized traditional African life informed Collomb's restructuring of the clinic and guided his reconceptualization of psychiatric care at Fan. African existence, Collomb wrote in 1967, is collective. It is not yet submitted to the laws of efficiency and productivity. It is animated by speech, dance and rhythm, communal meals. So Africa, Collomb and L'École de Fan's essentialist view was reflected in many ethnological accounts of Senegal and of other parts of sub-Saharan Africa at that time. Crucially, I'll know, kind of talk more about this later, but crucially the way that traditional African values and lifeways were imagined both within Senghor's project and at Fan, at the Fan Psychiatric Clinic, tended to downplay Islam and its influence as constitutive of tradition, despite the fact that Islam's presence in the region dates back to the 11th century. Okay, so by the early 1960s, Collomb was calling for a reassessment of the validity and the efficacy of Western psychiatric models in non-Western places. The Fan group advocated for a new and highly localized kind of psychiatry that not only took patients' social and cultural worlds into account, but allowed itself to be modified by these other worlds. The Western psychiatrist, Collomb wrote, necessarily experiences acculturation. The observer is modified by his observation. A better approach to psychiatry in Africa supposes the abandonment, or at very least the modification, of Western frameworks. So two key facets of the Fan School's innovative approach that I explore in my book are, first, the group's commitment to understanding local explanations of madness and treatment as the key to building an effective clinical practice at Fan. So the way they shifted a kind of biological approach to mental illness to one that took as primary the social, familial, symbolic worlds of patients themselves. This also clearly marked the group's turn toward a more psychodynamic approach to psychiatry rather than a kind of biological approach to psychiatry. And then the second facet I explore in my book is the group's effort to create a culturally informed therapeutic community within the clinic. As Collomb and L'École de Fan modified the physical space of the clinic, collaborated with healers, and opened new lines of theoretical inquiry about mental illness in Senegal, they also transformed their practical approach to treatment and therapy, implementing several innovative practices into Fan's repertoire. According to the Fan psychiatrist and past director, Professor Montmarguet, quote, opening the doors of the clinic, along with introducing patients' families and instating group therapy sessions that resembled village meetings, allowed for the possibility of having human relationships within the psychiatric hospital. In the mid-1960s, Collomb and his colleagues instituted these weekly group therapy sessions that were called pench meetings, pench being kind of the Wolof word for the place under the tree that one meets for kind of village meeting. In 1971, the clinic began requiring patients to have a family member or friend, an accompagnant, stay with them for the period of their hospitalization. These practices, along with the introduction of frequent communal meals, ataya sessions, doll crafting, games, theater production, a monthly newspaper that was initiated by patients themselves. So this is an ink drawing that was done in 1980 of Collomb at a pench session. And then this is the patient newspaper or journal that was published irregularly, but fairly frequently in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It was called Penchum Fan. All of these kind of laid the foundation for a new kind of therapeutic community at Fan. Notable was the group's effort to integrate locally recognizable and ordinary cultural practices in this setting, amidst an array of other kind of occupational activities that emphasize creative expression, especially through art and writing. So while the goal of this integration of the kind of African practices within the clinic was certainly motivated by the desire to bring culturally familiar elements to the clinic in a way that would keep patients from feeling isolated, one could also argue that the decontextualization and re-scripting of local forms as craft or as hobby and as specifically authentic ways of being amidst other possibilities played an important role in the transforming of subjectivities and sensibilities at Fan. So one example of this, for example, is the art therapy that was instituted at Fan and the way in which women were invited in as well as men, right? So there was this kind of subtle shifting of gender roles and kind of sexual divisions of labor in the clinic that in some ways formed new kinds of sensibilities around what a modern subject might be and could be. Transforming subjectivities and sensibilities, and Fan's emphasis on creative self-expression, in some ways I think it could be argued, privileged a historically and culturally specific version of the self, a kind of Western post-Enlightenment self, autonomous, individualized, equipped with rational self-awareness and the power of reflection, that was as crucial to Fan's rising orientation as it was crucial to Senghor's vision of this kind of new Senegalese modernity. So I have pictures now of these three practices. So the pench sessions, not the newspaper, but the accompagnant policy and also art therapy actually still take place today, although they've been transformed to a certain degree. These are paintings that were painted by current and past patients at Fan. The Art Therapy Center is kind of an incredible place, and the head of it, Alassane Seck, has done a great job kind of promoting this form of therapy. He's recently done exhibits of this work in Austria. He's shown work in Canada as well. It's really, really interesting stuff. Okay, so what I want to do now is just turn quickly to talk about Senghor's vision for this new Senegalese modernity. So when Senghor became the first president of independent Senegal in 1960, he envisioned for the new nation this distinctly Senegalese style of modernity. During his nearly 5 terms and 20 years in office, he worked to create modern citizens and define Senegalese national identity by molding political subjectivities and aesthetic sensibilities alike. According to Markowitz, who's a historian, Senghor desired to, quote, stimulate in the people of Senegal a new awareness, sense of commitment, and moral awakening in order to achieve unity and economic development, end quote. Senghor sought to cultivate this by promoting educational initiatives, cultural enrichment programs, and certainly the arts. It's estimated that while he was president, Senghor channeled nearly 25% of Senegal's national budget into the Ministry of Culture, which is kind of an incredible amount. But upon what was Senghor's vision for Senegal based, and what exactly did Senghor take special interest in Collomb's project at Fan for? So I trace in my book how Senghor's early ideas about negritude not only informed his political philosophy as president, but also came to be a kind of national style and symbol for the new state. So first I start out by talking just for a little bit about negritude as a literary and cultural movement, a national aesthetic, and a state ideology. While studying in Paris in the 1930s, Senghor had met a number of writers, poets, philosophers, and activists from French West Africa and the Caribbean, including Léon Gondrin Damas, Aimé Césaire, and Aimé Césaire. To Senghor, as he kind of grew his conceptualization of negritude, negritude represented an ontological fact, a condition of Black existence and Black being in the world. His concept of negritude took a very divergent path from that of Césaire, who had coined the term in 1939 in Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal. To Césaire, negritude was the invocation of a shared experience of racial, cultural, historical, and political subjugation, not a natural or essential characteristic of Blackness. He asserted that, so this is Césaire, my negritude has a ground. It's a fact that there is a Black culture. It is historical. There is nothing biological about it. Later, Césaire distinguished his perspective even further from Senghor, stating that, quote, Senghor made a kind of metaphysics. Here we go. Senghor made a kind of metaphysics out of negritude. There we parted company. He tended rather to construct negritude into an essentialism, as though there were a Black essence, a Black soul. But I never accepted this point of view. So as a reaction to colonial racism, alienation, and the presumed superiority of Western values, the negritude writers composed poetry and prose that celebrated Black experience. Senghor would later refer to this as a celebration of quote-unquote African ontology. And Jean-Paul Sartre would term it distinctly, quote, anti-racist racism, end quote. Senghor's negritude described Africa's children as sharing a fundamental spirit and unity that was different from and in opposition to that of Europe. So Senghor's negritude sought to embrace and elevate the essence of African experience. It was a kind of positive valuation of the history, beliefs, and values of traditional Africa. Viewed by many as a necessary tool in repairing the historical and psychological damage done by colonialism, Senghor's negritude nevertheless met with harsh criticism, even condemnation, by scholars and intellectuals across the African diaspora for both essentializing and depoliticizing Black experience. Years later, Senghor would write that negritude had been developed, negritude had been, quote, developed as a weapon, as an instrument of liberation. For its poetic expression of Black experience, however, negritude writers were particularly well received by the French avant-garde. By the 1920s, modernism and the appeal of what was called l'art nègre had ushered a fashionable interest in Africa. Negritude was born and thrived in this milieu in France. Senghor established himself as a central figure in the movement between the wars, and after World War II, his fame continued to grow. He was still dedicated to literary pursuits and more prolific than ever, and it was at that time that he became really actively involved in politics during the post-war years. With this shift into the world of politics also came a shift in his concept of negritude. Whereas Senghor had once posited negritude as a rejection of Western values and an elevation of Africanness, he now asserted that Africa and the West were intertwined and invaluable to each other. Negritude, Senghor would write, as the first president of Senegal, quote, has enriched European civilization and has been enriched by it. By the mid-1960s, Senghor was referring to negritude as what he called a humanism of the 20th century, and that had much to contribute to what he called the civilization of the universal. So he writes, negritude is the sum of the cultural values of the Black world, as these are expressed in the life, the institutions, and in the works of Negroes. Our sole preoccupation since 1932 to 1934 has been to assume this negritude by living it, having lived it, to seek for its deeper meaning, to present it to the world as the cornerstone in the construction of the civilization of the universal. So a civilization of the universal, said Senghor, was much needed in the divided but interdependent world of the 20th century. And negritude, he said, had an important role to play in it. His new approach emphasized the singularity of Black contributions to civilization and aspired to demonstrate the value and significance of negritude to all people in the world. Okay. So Senghor's concept of negritude evolved alongside and in conjunction with his political career, as art historian Ima Ebong has argued. It had direct bearing upon his political philosophy and his vision for the newly independent Senegal. So Ebong writes that it was when Senghor attained this dual role as culture broker and president that negritude began to achieve the status of a national aesthetic, transgressing its boundary as Senghor's own personal philosophy to inhabit a more public place as the cultural constitution of the nation. Senghor's early nation-building projects celebrated tradition, authenticity, and an African essence, claiming these to be at the very heart of the modern nation. Again, I think it's very important to note that within his own political discourse and philosophical writings on negritude and on the civilization of the universal, Senghor had very little to say about the place and role of Islam in West African tradition and culture. He himself, of course, was Catholic, but in his view, it was the idea that there was a shared African spirit that would unite the country, not religion or religious unity. Negritude values had the capacity, he thought, to transcend religious difference. The sort of spiritual socialism that he professed and that would become the trademark of the new nation was supported both by the devoutly Catholic Senghor and his Muslim compatriot and statecraft, Senegal's first prime minister, Mamadou Dia, who later had a falling out and was actually imprisoned by Senghor. And it was founded on the principles of secular governance. It was negritude then that would become the kind of national style and symbol of Senghor's Senegal. In it, what Evie Daniel would call the aestheticizing impulse of the new nation state found its form. So L'École de Dakar, promise I'm almost done. So the privileged place of negritude in Senghor's Senegal inspired the creation of an intellectual and artistic movement during the years following independence. This was focused especially around the University of Dakar and l'École nationale des beaux-arts in Dakar. L'École de Dakar, the Dakar School, as the movement was called, sought to embrace negritude in such diverse fields as literature, philosophy, history, science, and the arts, and sought to articulate, quote-unquote, traditional Africa in distinctively modern ways. L'École de Dakar played an important role in Senghor's vision for modern Senegal, and the movement received both support and accolades from Senghor and his government for expressing this new kind of Senegalese modernity. In his 1980 work entitled La Poésie de l'Action, Conversation avec Mohamed Aziza, for instance, Senghor asserted that L'École de Dakar exemplified modern Senegalese thought. Here he traced the origins of the movement and the modernization of Senegalese thought itself back to the handful of students who founded the negritude movement in the 1930s, himself included. Further, he explained that, I'm sorry, this is a long quote, I just want to make sure it's here as I'm reading the quotes of other people. It is necessary, wrote Senghor, for us Black Africans to root ourselves in the values of negritude, to hold on to our gifts of analogy and of rhythm. We must not imitate nature, but recreate it by thinking it, and especially by dreaming it. It remains that without abandoning the art of our ancestors, we want to enrich ourselves with the fecund contributions that come from abroad. It is also necessary for us to assimilate the discursive reason of Europe into our own way of thinking. The problem is that all too often we turn our backs to logic. It is against this laxity, a laxity to which our political writers frequently succumb, not to mention our philosophers, that the Senegalese government has been reacting since independence by prioritizing mathematics on the one hand and the Black imagination on the other. It is this double effort to reconcile authenticity and modernity that characterizes that which is known as l'École de Dakar. So after independence, Senghor tells us, the will of the government and creativity of l'École de Dakar were aligned in an effort to craft a new Senegalese modernity by merging the traditional and the modern, the art of our ancestors and the discursive reason of Europe. And although L'École de Dakar is best known today as a literary and artistic movement that came out of Senegal in the 1960s and 1970s, Senghor himself actually insisted that it was not in these areas, but in medicine, in the field of psychiatry in particular, that some of the, quote, most productive, most positive work was accomplished by L'École de Dakar. The unique theoretical and clinical orientation of the Fan Psychiatric Clinic during the 1960s and 1970s not only attracted Senghor's attention, but earned Fan's brand of psychiatry a prominent position within L'École de Dakar. In fact, in an interview that appeared in Senegal's most widely circulated newspaper in 1998, the then director of the Fan Psychiatric Clinic even went so far as to claim that, quote, if one speaks of L'École de Dakar at all, it is because of psychiatry. So the Fan Psychiatric Clinic then became a kind of jewel in Senghor's crown, an emblem of his vision for this new and distinctly Senegalese kind of modernity. But in those early independence years, was Senghor at all uneasy about crediting Collomb and his mostly French colleagues for this achievement? The answer, it seems, is no. Senghor's idea about this civilization of the universal all but required the blurring and crossing of racial boundaries. To Senghor, some of the most compelling examples of the modern expression of negritude in art were also European and not of Senegalese origin. So early in the 20th century, Europe's images and ideas of Africa had been central to the development of European modernism. Decades later, Senghor would uphold European modernism as an example of what negritude as a new African modernism could and perhaps should look like. So for example, extolling the work of Picasso, Senghor once declared that, quote, no artist could be more exemplary. He is a model for L'École de Dakar, and his closeness to us here is a rich inspiration. He also talked elsewhere about a Belgian artist coming in and walking through L'École de Dakar, walking through the L'École des Beaux-Arts, and seeing the work that was being done. And Senghor says, you know, I was nervous at first because instead of being purely abstract work that was being produced, it's still somewhat figurative. And I thought, maybe this means that these young Senegalese artists haven't quite embraced this new kind of Senegalese modernity, right? They weren't truly doing abstract work. But he says, then I realized this is exactly what L'École de Dakar needs to be doing. So very complicated kind of racial politics here, which I'll be happy to talk about after my talk. So just as Senghor praised Picasso as a model for L'École de Dakar, he also applauded Collomb and other doctors at Fan for affirming negritude ideals and promoting a new model of Senegalese modernity. Senghor not only praised Collomb for being a, quote, Frenchman who knew how to kill the most firmly established prejudices, end quote, but even went so far as to credit him for having made himself nègre avec les nègres, or black amongst blacks, while working at Fan. And again, I can take these racial politics, I take the racial politics up in my book in various different ways, and I'll be happy to talk about them after. So in Senghor's eyes, Collomb's ability to move across cultural landscapes and blur racial boundaries was absolutely desirable. Throughout his life, Senghor proudly and vocally attempted to do the same. In fact, his hopes for achieving a civilization of the universal were predicated on this very movement. And the civilization of the universal was being actualized in the cross-cultural psychiatric work that was the hallmark of the early years of the Fan Psychiatric Clinic. Thank you very much for your time and for listening to all that, and I welcome your questions and comments. Yeah.
So, I am...
You speak French. It was not simply that. You said there was also a cultural misunderstanding. Because there is gesture and gesture. Doing this may mean yes somewhere, but somewhere else it may mean no. Doing this may mean no somewhere, but somewhere else it may mean yes. And it reminds me of the passage in Ambiguous Adventure by Sheikh Hamidou Khan, the madman. I don't know if you remember how Le Fou, the madman, describes his first experience, in France. he asked to imagine a place created by man, but which is forbidden to man. That's the street, and the street light. Yellow, wait. Red, don't go. Green, go. And the new speedways which are being created here, and what a Western eye could consider as absolute chaos. Those areas are not to be crossed by any human being. They are exclusively reserved to cars. But see how people in Dakar behave. There is no prohibition. There is no part of the city which is prohibited. These are for cars, but they are going to just jump and cross where they should not. You know, that's why this idea of trying to bring in the African dimension of patience, as someone wanted to do it, in order for whatever cure or whatever attempt to help them comes in, will be integrated to their cultural background. And I am particularly interested in this because it may be in the medical sector, but it is anthropology. And, it brings back the need to maybe weave local realities to whatever reality is brought in order for the thing to work. Another thing is, and I said this one day when one of my staff was going to the United States, and I asked my daughter, because he was friend to my daughter, and I asked her, and I tell her, ask him how he is going to negotiate an escalator. I don't know if you're thinking about what I'm thinking. An escalator, keep rolling, rolling, rolling. You don't know how you're going to put your first foot on. You start, you hesitate, you put your foot and then you remove it. And when you are about to get off the escalator, you don't do it like this, you jump over. Because you think it is going simply to swallow your feet and your toes. So all these are things which just tells us about the complexity of negotiating cross-cultural situations. And you brought it out, but what I most appreciated with your presentation is something, unfortunately, in this country we have completely forgotten. All these things. President Senghor, I have a high respect for him, but I am not an unconditional admirer. But I'm trying to put on the table what is really true. Because somewhere he said, we need to be careful to make sure that where we're going to meet the world, we understand what we're going to meet. And before meeting that, we'll be firmly established on our own values and realities so that we can negotiate and ingest whatever is ingestible because of good from the other side. And this is what he tried to do. But you see, the moment Collomb left, the young, psychiatrist full of revolutionary ideas, because in those days, you were in, if you said to hell, Senghor, but you were absolutely out of fashion, out of everything. If you said, I clap my hands, you were a reactionary. I went through this, I was very young, extremely young. I was in secondary school. I hated strikes. Because strikes meant sitting in my house, not doing anything, and I wanted to go to school every single day. But I remember, when we were young, on the side of China, or on the side of Russia, pro-Mao, pro-je ne sais qui, and that was the fashion. But now, after chewing all this, maybe we need to get back to that and realize that the first edition of a World Festival of Negro Arts, if ever there was any successful edition, which made the entire black diaspora and Africa come together and talk, that was what he did. Not the Algerian edition, not the Nigerian edition, and Abdoulaye Wade edition was a complete mess. So maybe get back and maybe give it his due, and I think this is a contribution. And let me tell you one thing, I was discussing the other day with a very great intellectual in this country, and we were thinking about revisiting Senghor, see what he did, and which was absolutely not necessarily good, but also be able to face at least what he did, which was a good contribution to nation building and to the advancement of his country. And when we agree to do it, I certainly will contact you if there is any possibility to bring in this anthropological contribution. And to the attendants, thank you very much for coming. For those going to Tuba, I wish you a very good Magal. Yeah. For those not going and having to rest tomorrow, I will tell you sleep until about 10 and take a late breakfast.
And for me, who is going to the airport tonight, trying to get on the road.
Yeah. Well, that is now in our Tuba, so it should be more. Yeah.
Inshallah.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you.